Welcome to our show, Unlearning, with me, Skhumbuzo Jwara, where each week we discuss a social issue through the lens of a book I've read. Please remember to press the like button because it helps place our channel higher up in recommendations. Also, don't forget to subscribe and switch on the notifications bell so you're updated when we post new content. Today we're filming at exclusive books Sandton City, and the books we're looking at are available at the store. Now, our aim is not to give a blow-by-blow, chapter-by-chapter review of the books we read. There are many other channels that do that and who could perhaps do it even better than we could. Rather, our aim is to explore social issues that affect us daily, using the books we read as a way to think about them critically and introduce a level of empathy that is otherwise missing in the conversation and in today's popular culture. This week we've read two books. Rape, A South African Nightmare by Phumla Dineo-Xola, which explores an array of issues around South Africa's relationship to rape, our responses to it, and the shock disbelief syndrome, and rape culture, and also our violent masculinities. It also takes a look at high-profile rape trials like those of former President Jacob Zuma, Bob Hewitt, and others. Our second book, 12 Rules for Life, by Jordan Peterson, which is a self-help manual for young people written with the aim of setting out simple principles that can help them in becoming more disciplined, act with integrity, behave better, and balance our lives while enjoying them as best we can at the beginning. Now, it may seem as though an odd choice in a discussion around gender-based violence, but as our aim is to direct the conversation towards men and having a conversation around masculinity that veers away from toxic masculinity, it is an important read. We also have some words from Professor Kopano Radele, whose yet to be published book, Why Men Hurt Women and Other Reflections, presents valuable insight into men and how our violent behavior in society. The book will only be released in September, at which point we'll have a broader discussion around it and use it as a lens through which to further discuss gender-based violence.
If you subscribe to the view that men have to control others, to be regarded as men, if you accept that masculinity means power over others, not power for others, but power over others, if those people cannot be controlled by benign means, it means that men will use violence to control them. So two things then. You have a history that made your society into a particular kind of history. You have in the center, in the middle of that history, a patriarchal masculinity that governs that society. It is an easy step for you, for many men, for us to accept that violence against women is not such an outrage. It means we think this is just the way the world is. So I should say, that does not mean we have to accept that because the world can be made differently, could have been made differently. We can subscribe to a different form of masculinity. For instance, a caring masculinity.
The term gender-based violence is so widely used that it has now begun to sound like a clickbait phrase that means nothing except that it allows politicians to sound like they care about a substantive issue. And it deserves serious and earnest discussion amongst all of us, particularly men who are the primary perpetrators of gender-based violence. Yes, men get abused too, but in our relatively short episode, cases of abuse towards men are statistically as significant as the brevity with which we can offer the following advice. If you're an abused man, there are support groups that exist that will deal with your case without the public shame associated. It's a serious matter and deserves the concern and care your situation warrants. When speaking about gender-based violence, and particularly in instances where most violent aspects of it occur in the public eye, such as rape and murder, we naturally always then speak about consequences to these most heinous of crimes. And the constant outcry is for the consequences to be capital punishment or the death penalty. The outcry is rooted in society's desire for justice. And justice is important because it is one of the most fundamental social, ethical, and moral principles we deal with every day. But justice also means different things to different people, particularly in the area of criminal justice, where although the general consensus is that the punishment must fit the crime, what the punishment is becomes contested. When it comes to capital punishment or the death penalty, there are two main opposing camps. The retributivists who believe in retribution, an eye for an eye, meaning that if you are found guilty of murder or even rape, the penalty must be death. On the other hand of the scale are abolitionists who have a more social justice perspective and are against the death penalty at all costs. But even though the death penalty has been struck down as unconstitutional in South Africa, there does need to be some form of justice, even if not retribution. And South Africa has taken an approach that can broadly be described as welfare maximization, where some of the punishment is necessary, even though not necessarily an eye for an eye. And more specifically, particularly within the area of criminal law, restorative justice. Restorative justice is an approach to justice that aims to involve the parties to a dispute and others affected by the harm, victims, offenders, families concerned, and community members, in collectively identifying harms, needs, and obligations through accepting responsibilities and making restitution, and taking measures to prevent a recurrence of the incident and crime while promoting reconciliation. Restorative justice sees crime as an act against the victim and shifts the focus to repairing the harm that has been committed against the victim and the community. Now, obviously, in cases of a lost loved one and of rape as a consequence of gender-based violence, restorative justice becomes controversial, particularly when perpetrators are never convicted in the first place, which is often the case and is where most of South Africa's problems are located when it comes to gender-based violence. So why is it important to take serious consideration about the death penalty and not simply resort to it as a solution when we witness the most violent of crimes in society? Well, I'd like to borrow from the late Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Arthur Chaskalson, who expressed a somber and sobering thought about the death penalty in the case that struck down the death penalty for being inconsistent with the Constitution of South Africa. That case was S versus Makwanyane. He says, "Death is the most extreme form of punishment to which a convicted criminal can be subjected. Its execution is final and irrevocable." End quote. Simply put, when someone is killed as a consequence of the death penalty being imposed, there is no going back. There is no debate about whether or not justice has been met or on the cruelty of the sentence. The person is killed at the hands of the law, and we all become complicit in that decision as society. All of us. There are a few main reasons why the death penalty as a solution to crimes, even the most heinous within gender-based violence, is not a palatable or reasonable solution. Because the nature of criminal proceedings is that they are expensive for individuals to defend, particularly against the state that has near unlimited resources. A poor person accused of a crime for which the penalty is death is at a significant disadvantage in defending themselves as compared to a wealthier accused person who has access to financial resources that would give them a fighting chance. In South Africa, we already see how disproportionately, even cases involving petty crimes are consistently convicted more in the case of poor accuseds versus wealthy accuseds. And in a country where poverty and wealth is closely linked to race, the disproportionate amount of convictions are of poor people of color. And as former Chief Justice Arthur Chaskalson correctly and soberly pointed out about the potential for an innocent person being put to death, as happens when innocent people are convicted and put behind bars, is that there are often errors as a consequence of the distinctions between access to resources in the criminal justice system. And whether or not it is acceptable becomes a gruesome question when the difference is between life and death. Arthur Chaskalson says, unjust imprisonment is a great wrong, but if it is discovered, the prisoner can be released and compensated. But the killing of an innocent person is irredeemable. On public opinion, even if we accept the suggestion that a majority of South Africans support the death penalty for serious crimes like murder and rape, it would not be persuasive enough an argument to reinstate the death penalty. And why? Consider, for instance, that when our Constitutional Court recognized gay marriage as legal under our law, a majority of South Africans under various polls were found to be against marriage for the LGBTIQ+ community. Public opinion sways, and is only a snapshot of the majority's feelings at a particular moment in time. The law, however, particularly in a constitutional democracy, is there to remain consistent and direct us to our values despite our swaying views on a matter of public importance. This is not to say that the outcry for justice is not valid, rather that it must be measured against the agreed upon vision for the society we envisaged when embarking on this journey of a constitutional democracy, where everyone's rights and responsibilities are subject only to the law, with the Constitution as the supreme law of this country.
Well, we have to look at really what are the underlying drivers of violence against women, and then that really needs to sort of inform what our collective response is. You know, we see in countries all over the world that have abolished the death penalty because we know it's an ineffective deterrent to all types of crime, including violent crime, including crime against women and children. In the United States, 29 states still have the death penalty. And of those 29 states, they have homicide rates that are that range from 48% to 101% higher than states without the death penalty. So we know it's an ineffective deterrent to crime.
We must ask ourselves why the death penalty is being called for in the first place. One of the answers is, of course, justice, which would be fair. But justice is an after-the-fact desire for those who seek morally acceptable retribution for a serious crime, particularly in instances of murder and rape as a consequence of gender-based violence. The more substantive answer is that people see the death penalty as an effective deterrent, that criminals would reconsider their actions more out of fear if the consequences of their crime would be death, than if it was simply life imprisonment. But we know that this is not true and is not backed by evidence. The real deterrent to crimes as heinous and brutal as murder and rape that are linked to gender-based violence is the possibility and hopefully the certainty of being caught. And that's an issue of competent policing and an effective justice system that convicts perpetrators consistently and successfully, unlike is the case at present, where victims often have to live in the same communities as the perpetrators of their abuse. It's important that we understand what exactly we mean when we speak about abuse, because it's a very specific kind of violence. Abuse is about an imbalance of power and control. In an unhealthy abusive relationship, there may be unhealthy behaviors from even both or all parties, but in an abusive relationship, one person tends to have more control than the other. And that element of an imbalance of power is a crucial element because it helps us eliminate instances that are not abuse, even when there is violence involved. A partner in an unhealthy and abusive relationship who resorts to violence to defend themselves cannot be then said to be the one who is abusive. And abusive partners know this very well because they often claim that a partner who used violence in self-defense was also abusive. And this muddies the waters to such an extent that we are left unconvinced as to who the abuser is and who was the victim. In her book, Phumla Dineo explores this blame shifting in a chapter about myths we perpetuate about rape culture, which have the devastating consequence of emboldening perpetrators and re-traumatizing victims. And being able to distinguish between the perpetrator and victim, particularly in public conversations, is imperative. Some of the myths around rape culture, which she eloquently debunks, include the following. Firstly, that perpetrators are monsters who are abusive all of the time. This is a particularly dangerous myth that we often hear, and when we describe perpetrators as monsters who are not like other men. But this is dangerous and a lie, because it helps shield men who are abusive in private but know how to behave with politeness in public, which leads to victims of abuse oftentimes not being believed because the perpetrators was seen as gentle, quiet, or upstanding. People who commit these acts of violence against women and children, even rape and murder, are not monsters. They're men who look like your brother, father, uncle. They are your pastors, popular sportsmen, respected businessmen, or even politician. They're even a man who advocates against gender-based violence in the public eye. A man who commits violence against women and children could even be me. And it's an important point to make because there's constant public shock when men who are admired within their communities are revealed to have been violent and perpetrators of abuse or even murder. And this shock serves only to create an environment where such men are defended by the public even when there is evidence to their crimes, even when they are convicted. As Phumla Jwara points out, the only thing rapists have in common is their refusal to accept no as an answer. And by extension, that perpetrators of gender-based violence have in common is that they abuse. A second myth is that dressing up in a certain way invites rape, or behaving in a particular way invites abuse. This one is particularly dangerous because it serves the purpose of shifting blame and shame to the victim, who must then take responsibility for a violent act that was against them. The same can be said of abuse. Excuses that perpetrators often make are that the behavior of their partners caused the abuse, either by cheating, not doing domestic duties, or even as ludicrous as that their partners were too loud. None of these warrant abuse or invite it. Both rape and other instances of gender-based violence are about power and not seduction or anything a victim has done. There are other myths that she debunks in her book, which you can read about. Recent and popular case that is still in the courts at the time of recording exhibits the hallmarks of what causes confusion and is used by abusive partners to defend themselves. In the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case, which is presently at court, the term mutual abuse has been used often. And it's important that we understand that there is no such thing as mutual abuse. Because abuse, as we've just explained, requires the important element of an imbalance of a power dynamic. We're not making commentary about the merits of the case, simply cautioning that we use the correct definitions because abusive individuals use cases such as this one and the language we then accept, like mutual abuse, as a way to deflect from their abusive nature and direct the shame towards victims. A relationship can be toxic and violent, as was clearly the case with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case. But there still can only ever be one abuser in a relationship.